on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest covers criminal justice issues and politics for The Intercept. Akela Lacy is a politics reporter. I believe that's her title there at The Intercept. I've been reading her for quite a while, wanted to have her on the show for a while, so I'm glad she's able to join us. And the reason, the stimulus for my inviting her was a specific piece. We may move beyond that in our conversation, but the specific piece was ICE. You know what ICE is? Disobeyed Biden's order to drop Trump's blanket deportation policy. So first of all, Akela Lacy, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're delighted to have you. Subheading for your piece, Akela, is a third of ICE enforcement actions during Biden's first year in office targeted people who posed no threat to public safety. So give us a little background on this, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So shortly after President Joe Biden took office, the administration issued new guidelines for ICE, namely to prioritize three specific categories for enforcement action. So people who fell into categories determined by the Department of Homeland Security for national security, public safety, and border security. So ICE was told, as of after these guidelines went out, you don't need to do indiscriminate enforcement, meaning that people who pose a security or safety risk should be prioritized. So that means not people who are undocumented, who are necessarily working towards a path to citizenship and might not have proper documentation, or people who are pursuing DACA, people outside of those categories. And this report that was published by the American Immigration Council and some of their partners, they had requested data from ICE enforcement actions for the first 10 months of the administration following the issuance of those guidelines. And they just recently published this report earlier this month, finding that or at least a third of ICE's enforcement actions in the first year of Biden's presidency did not follow those guidelines. So that meant that ICE was directing its resources towards enforcing, so either detaining, making arrests, or otherwise detaining folks who did not pose a security threat. And this is obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but continuing effectively what was the guidance and the immigration policy under former President Donald Trump, which was basically indiscriminate enforcement action, no matter who you are, what level of threat you pose to the community. If it's no threat whatsoever, you're out of here. And so that is what we saw ICE continuing to do even after President Biden took office.
And if I remember from junior high civics class, ICE, which didn't exist then, but now where it is, its boss's boss is the president of the United States. I think I've still got that right. So yeah. they're basically telling the president to go take a flying F. I mean, maybe not, that directly, but your piece says the president said, don't go after people who don't threaten public security. As you just said, at least a third of its enforcement actions did exactly that. It also said now correct me if I've got this wrong, Akela, but yeah, they were directed to get approval for any such action before they took it. They got approval 89.5% of the time, but in 11% of the cases, they did it before they got approval, or maybe they didn't get approval, but they did it anyway. So even their own internal rules aren't being followed. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So the report found that, they found that only a certain number of the cases actually had dates for when the approval was requested or when the enforcement action was carried out. So these numbers could be lower than what the actual numbers are, but you're correct. So in the vast majority of cases that approval was requested, which is what was stipulated in the guidelines, that you have to get written approval for anyone who falls outside of those three categories. 89, basically they're rubber stamping. That number is a rubber stamp, 89.5% of the requests are approved. And then you find out that in 11% of those cases, the date of the approval was prior to the date of the request. So effectively that there was no request and that it was approved anyway. So I think, the authors of the report and some of the experts that I spoke with point out that raises questions about the validity of the data itself. And it also raises questions about what the purpose of these internal mechanisms, oversight mechanisms are if they're not being followed.
Right. And I guess this question could be, the answer could be interpreted a few different ways, but you talked to the people, the group, the American Immigration Council, who did the study. You talked to some other, as you said, activists in this field. Were they shocked or surprised at the results, this sort of disregarding of the president's orders?
No, not really. I mean, part of the response is, sort of in the people responding to the context that ICE itself has sort of become a politicized body, particularly under the Trump administration, even under the Obama administration. They challenged Obama's guidelines on deportations, and Obama deported, more people than anyone else. And so this is not the first time that they have defied, administrative orders, but they do have a history of doing that, particularly under Democratic presidents. That's part of it. The other piece is that ICE is part of a massive, sprawling bureaucratic apparatus under DHS, and that it's understandable that as soon as a new administration takes office, you're not going to expect to see people following new guidelines, communicating these new guidelines effectively or enforcing them immediately. But, within the first 10 months, you expect to see some sort of change. And so I think some people gave the benefit of the doubt that it does take time to put these actions into place. But it's unlikely that there was, based on the numbers and the timing of the data that they collected relative to the guidelines, there's not a ton of evidence that there was a lot of willpower within particularly higher ups to be checking on whether these guidelines were being followed, particularly as evidenced by the pre-approval process that we just discussed.
One of the sentences, and if you're not comfortable going beyond your information dissemination function into opinion, that's okay. I understand that, but Akela, one of the questions that really, or one of the sentences rather, that really jumped out at me from your piece was the White House directed, you asked the White House about this, and your sentence reads, the White House directed questions to the Department of Homeland Security, which did not reply to a request for comment. That kind of fits with what you just said, doesn't it? That there's not really zeal on the part of what you might call the political appointees, the political chain of command, to chase this question down and see what's being enforced and what isn't. Is that a fair conclusion for me to draw, you think?
I think that's fair. I think, and I'm comfortable speaking about this just in the terms of the broader context and other reporting that myself and my colleagues have done. But, the Biden administration, one of the major, this is not necessarily a top priority for them for a number of reasons, but also I think it's an area where Republican messaging has been very effective. Republican attacks on sort of, saying that the border situation is out of control. We've seen Biden go up against Republican officials in other states. I mean, to enforce his guidelines on immigration, and actually this report came right on the heels of a Supreme Court ruling that actually ruled in Biden's favor in a case where Texas and Louisiana had sought to what's the word I'm looking for? Find and excuse themselves from following these guidelines and challenged them in court. It went to the Supreme Court, which ruled in the administration's favor. But all that to say that this has obviously been a very highly politicized issue. It's an election. We're coming into an election cycle, and I don't necessarily think the administration sees it as beneficial to publicize, and the fact that they are directing ICE to change its enforcement policies, because I think that plays into some of the Republican attacks that you're seeing, that there's no enforcement at the border. Obviously, that's not really the case, but I think it's easy enough for Republicans to take that and make the argument or build on their argument. So, I mean, that is one point that has come across, has come to mind for me, but, it's
sure.
not for the administration to say, for sure.
Yeah, no, that's totally logical. And unfortunately, and one of the things these statistics show is there's a human consequence to looking the other way. I have to tell you, excuse me, again, that this falls under the sort of editorial comment, but for a long time, as I've tracked ICE and what it does, I think they're scary people. I think they, I remember some of their disregarding of the Obama administration's instructions, and bearing in mind that from my point of view, even the Democrats are particularly wildly leftist about immigration, to say the least. So the idea of this sort of politicized law enforcement agency, I don't think people realize what broad abilities it has to, go anywhere within however many miles it is of any point of entry into the United States, which includes airports and so on. So pretty broad geographic and other powers. The fact that it can, at times decides it's going to do what it wants, and what it wants is, is kind of rough. I find that scary.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to comment on it again, but, it's just one of my takeaways from what you wrote. So anything else you think people should know? Because there were a couple other things I wanted to ask you about before.
Yeah. I would point out, I didn't do a ton of reporting on this piece, but so it's not in the article, but something else that the author of the report pointed out to me is that some of the states and the localities where they were seeing the highest numbers or the greater percentages of these enforcement actions taking place outside of these three categories are places, some of them, New York and Chicago were at the top of the list, but Florida was also there. And they just pointed out that they were seeing heightened enforcement actions in states that had been active in sort of the politicization of the border issue, and even if they're not, necessarily on the border. And so yeah, that's something that I think is a fruitful area for more reporting, and for folks, particularly in those states, to be aware of that there's state level politics that are playing into some of the enforcement actions as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it is important. And since we're talking about state level politics, you also wrote a piece recently about Ron DeSantis. Everybody knows at the national level that the Republicans have stacked this, well, in my words, stacked the Supreme Court. It's states like Maryland, where I now live, the Republican governor, who's considered a moderate, he's got very pro-corporate people in the state Supreme Court here. But your piece said that DeSantis, well, the headline given to it was DeSantis stacked Florida's Supreme Court with cronies who wages war on wokeness or else. And I don't know if you write your headlines or subheads at The Intercept, but a subhead of all the flunkies Ron DeSantis installed across the state, the longest lasting effects will come from his total takeover of the Florida Supreme Court. Tell us about that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So, this reporting came sort of around the time that there was additional reporting from the Washington Post, actually, on Leonard Leo, the conservative judicial activist, and his role in helping to vet state Supreme Court nominees in Florida, for Ron DeSantis. I had been talking with some folks just about trying to do some additional reporting on DeSantis appointing political allies to various state agencies, things from, a real estate, oversight board all the way up to the Supreme Court, just sort of trying to talk to people and see, other areas for approval reporting. And a source that I spoke with pointed out that shortly after DeSantis took office and started appointing people to the Supreme Court, behind the scenes of the obvious sort of political machinations that Leonard Leo was involved in, the court had taken several specific actions to do away with diversity programs, diversity training requirements within the Supreme Court. Something that we reported in that story is that the Supreme Court had allegedly threatened to dissolve the state, the Florida bar, if it didn't change or eliminate these requirements that judges go through this diversity training, or do these continuing legal education course in diversity. And then, there's several other points throughout the story, just talking about sort of the political history of some of the justices, some of the background on, when a justice was up for Chief Justice who hadn't been appointed by DeSantis, he stepped down out of the blue, went to a GOP aligned law firm, and then a DeSantis ally who had been on the court for just a few years took over the Chief Justiceship. All of DeSantis's appointees have been Federalist Society members. One of them was married to one of the people that DeSantis recently appointed to the board that is overseeing Reedy Creek, which is the site of the Disney fiasco. He's
right.
He's in a First Amendment lawsuit with Disney as well, which we've been covering. And so just this story was sort of chipping away at the big web of his political appointees that has been so thoroughly reported, particularly by Florida media outlets, the Miami Herald, the Orlando Sun-Sentinel, sort of connecting some of the dots there, and putting it in the context of, if the governor has been able to do all of this in such a short time in Florida, what should we be aware of as his presidential campaign ramps up, and particularly because there's been so much sort of late in the game reporting now on how conservative activists, Harlan Crow, one example, influenced justices on the Supreme Court.
Right. And when I was reading your article, Akela, I at first I thought, well, this is a sort of a case study in ideological fanaticism, and the reason why, or extremism, and the reason why I use the word extremism is he's not just talking, for example, about his ideology. Ideology doesn't just reject affirmative action, for example, but even training programs, right, for diversity and equity and representation. Even that, is I read it as kind of saying, these programs that, whether it's the courts or anybody else, court system anywhere else, is put in to say, well, we should understand the issues around diversity or equality or what have you. No. So the first part of the article, I was kind of thinking, wow, this is ideological sort of cronyism and court packing rather than the old fashioned kind of corrupt kind. And then as I kept reading, I thought, well, hang on, there's the old fashioned corrupt kind too. Maybe I'm unfair, but you're right. DeSantis also stacked the states. For example, DeSantis also stacked the state's two medical boards, including an appointment for a real estate broker whose wife DeSantis had installed in a real estate appraisal board. That was ideological, but then there was the real estate broker going into the real estate appraisal board, never a good look. Then, quote unquote, bullying Florida political figures to support his ambition and pet causes. I guess my main takeaway was it's still mostly ideological cronyism, but it strikes me as, in a different sense maybe than we think of like Louisiana scandals or whatever. It strikes me as kind of a case of corruption, because these are not because he's getting kickbacks or whatever, but because these are not supposed to be positions that are ideological in most cases. You got what I'm trying to say? If so, you can probably say it better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, and this is something that has come up in conversation with sources throughout the reporting we've done. I mean, we did another story a couple months ago about DeSantis directing government contracts to his political donors, which I think is a little bit more in the category, the latter category that you're describing, as far as the appearance, at least, of potential impropriety, and but the fact that the DeSantis administration goes about this both in a way that's very overt and explicit in some cases, but then in other cases is, can be chalked up to, oh, well, that's politics. That's how state politics play out. It wasn't unusual for Rick Scott to give contracts to folks who had donated to his campaign. And there's not necessarily a clear line of impropriety there. But the difference that sort of captures both of these categories that you're talking about, both ideological cronyism and sort of more explicit, corruption or corruption adjacent stuff, is the scale at which the administration is doing it. And I think that lends itself a little bit more to questions about whether it's appropriate to call what he's doing corruption. And I think in some cases it certainly is, when you look at just the breadth and depth of his reach into state and local agencies. I think even it's just obviously the tip of the iceberg in some cases, but I think it's very clear that there is a political motivation to all of that, and I think that gives evidence to what you need. Intent and evidence to prove corruption, right? And I think there's definitely evidence of both of that going on, at least in some of these appointments.
Yeah, and of course there's illegal corruption, and then there's corruption that's legal because the corrupt people are making the laws. So
right.
Let's pivot, if you don't mind, Akela, Lacy, and talk about another topic that you cover a lot, which is criminal justice, particularly, as someone who cares also a great deal about criminal justice issues. I think this is your most recent piece. I think as we record this, it just came out. Headline, which lifted my heart a little when I saw it. And NYPD to pay largest protester settlement ever for abuses during George Floyd uprising. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, absolutely. So this settlement was just made public shortly before midnight, this past midnight. So my editor published this, I think, at 1 a.m. So thank you to him for that. But this is the second settlement, in I think 4 months that the city settled the multi-million-dollar lawsuit with protesters who had been beaten with batons, kettled, pepper sprayed, subject to mass arrest without probable cause during the height of the protests against police brutality after the killing of George Floyd in 2020. This was a class action suit. The payout to protesters in this suit is historic. There's $13 million being paid to, I think, 1,300 protesters. And the key point in this case, and in the story that we wrote about the previous settlement in March, another similar settlement in Philadelphia around the same time, $9 million, is that the plaintiffs are relying on forensic reconstruction of events during the protests to build their case and sort of make it really clear exactly, the physical dimensions and of what the police did to folks. And I think we've been reporting a little bit about how that is aiding the deluge of class action protest lawsuits that we're seeing in states across the country. I think we linked to this in the story, but The Guardian wrote about the body of these lawsuits a few months ago, and it's something like $80 million across, a dozen or so states just in the last year or the last several years, paying out taxpayer dollars for police misconduct. And, while it's historic and it should be noted for that, and I think, the plaintiffs say, this settlement is appropriate given what the law says. The settlement, this case, and in previous settlements that we've written about, some settlements have included stipulations for official changes to police policy and conduct for police. This did not. And I think that while it's definitely being celebrated, there are still a lot of questions about what the value of a settlement like this is, particularly when police have not changed their tactics, since 2020, and that, there's no enforcement mechanism for implementing, significant or institutional reforms to the NYPD. And so while it's great that protesters are being paid, it's a reaction to the problem. And one of the plaintiffs that I spoke with said, the issues that they were protesting back in 2020 are still issues today. And so while they're very pleased with the settlement terms, that's a totally separate issue from addressing, what was at the root of the protests that were chilled by the retaliation that police demonstrated and that the city is now paying for. And I would add one more thing. I mean, the big issue here is that the police department does not have to pay for this, and until we've reported on this in the March story a little bit more in depth with some comments from professors who are a professor who studies this. Until there is a change to where the burden for these sorts of suits falls, until unless the police departments are required to pay for this, there's probably not going to be a ton of quick, at least, change that folks are seeing. So I think that's the real key.
Yeah, and and that's going to be hard to do in a city like New York, where the police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, or whatever it's called, is so politically powerful and is so politically aggressive. And of course, now you have an ex-police officer as mayor who has been, running on these issues and scaremongering on these issues. So it is going to be hard to affect real change for sure. I mean, I had a couple thoughts reading your piece. One was, I said my teenage years in and around New York, and, at the risk of offending somebody, the cops were dicks then and they're dicks now, but they are more militarized and weaponized, and that makes it scarier. But I was especially pleased to see it because I remember seeing the videos and so on of, like the police officer who knocked, somebody off their bicycle as they were passing by, and so I love that they're doing this forensic reconstruction. But you're right, until there's systemic change, it won't happen. Which gets to, I guess, the last thing I wanted to mention to you, which is or discuss with you, which is the whole issue of district attorney races. And we had Chesa Boudin on this program. Very good guy, very brilliant, very good DA. A lot of money was poured into making it look as if problems were his fault that were not his fault. He was even, in my view, kind of set up by the police, who reduced their arrest activity and then blamed him for the drop in arrest. And if I recall correctly, you've been covering that as well, right? I mean, at least one recent race where some money was being poured in. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is, I do a lot of coverage of this. We wrote about the Boudin race or the Boudin recall rather, and in his tenure. I've covered, the impeachment of Larry Krasner in Philadelphia last year, and we've covered, him since he was elected. Similarly with, Kim Gardner in St. Louis. The most recent piece that we wrote is about this attempt to recall Pamela Price, the district attorney in Alameda County, which includes Oakland. And so, yes, this is certainly, this is sort of the new frontier, at least in my opinion, on criminal justice reform is this back and forth. And it's really, a storytelling fight about exactly what's going on, who's responsible. And I think your point about the police reducing their arrest activity in San Francisco is a salient one that we're seeing not just in San Francisco, in lots of different places. And it's not a coincidence that the police are also spending intensely against these prosecutors. And then once they get into office and start prosecuting police for misconduct or directing, opening wrongful conviction units and focusing on police misconduct prosecutions, that's when you see the police response blaming individual attorneys for crime, saying that they can't make arrests for certain crimes because the prosecutor won't make a charge, and really misleading the public in cities across the country. I'm not exaggerating on this, deliberately misleading the public about what's going on. And, particularly in San Francisco, there's been some great reporting on this, particularly just how the drop in arrests under Boudin and the sharp increase shortly after he left office and after Brooke Jenkins took office. So it's not outlandish to bring that up. So yeah, and the Pamela Price recall is really notable because she's only been in office for 7 months. And we're seeing that nobody has funded the recall committee yet. None of who's behind it is public, but we're going to be hopefully doing some, additional reporting on that in the coming months.
And in my view, I think racial bigotry plays a role in this, in that, we've covered on this program that years ago, studies that show that disproportionate news coverage is given to violent crimes, and especially to violent crimes by black and brown people who, sometimes their images are literally darkened for the, just a whole racial subtext, or not even subtext, text. Mm-hmm. And that's part of it. But, it sounded like in reading your article about Oakland that this is just getting off the ground. But, for example, in Chesa Boudin's case, or the attempt to recall Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, or what have you, are there other groups that get involved besides the police unions? Are there, or do certain sorts of businesses get involved? Is it a way for businesses to ingratiate themselves with the local law enforcement? Or do you have a sense of the kind of other politics of it?
Yeah, so it varies from city to city, but, two examples come to mind. So in San Francisco, we saw Republican donors mostly funding there were several different, C4 groups that were involved in that race, like Grow SF, a Safer SF. They were funded by Republican donors and Democrats, but mostly, major Republican, millionaire tech people played a big role on that. We wrote, I think a year or two before Boudin was actually recalled, this major tech investor, Jason Calacanis, started a GoFundMe to, raise money to hire an independent reporter to quote unquote investigate the district attorney's office. So that's very San Francisco unique, the tech involvement. But then, we've seen in other cities, definitely Republican legislators were keyed and drove the original legislation that threatened to strip Kim Gardner in St. Louis strip her constituents of the power to elect their own attorney. That sort of drove what ended up becoming a campaign to get her out of office that was joined in, on both sides of the political spectrum. But that was one other example. And then there's one that I just was, I'm going to blank on this one. There's so many that we've been covering. It'll come back to me. But yes, there are definitely lots of different folks who are involved in this. There was also a group that launched to try to run someone against George Gascon in LA that was being funded by another Republican donor who lived in New York. It's a lot of individually wealthy folks.
It's similar to Chesa Boudin, I think, with Gascon in Los Angeles. Articles were planted and stories were planted in the press, right, about supposedly bad things they were doing. There was a media sort of PR campaign around it too. Yeah. It strikes me, I guess, that part of this, the impetus for that among these wealthy jerks is Republican groups too. And in Boudin's case, they bought the services of a lot of Democrats with their money and so on, that it fits the narrative of people who break the law or are suspected of breaking the law as terrifying, and that you can't humanize them, you can't treat them decently, you should be able to beat them up. So it's a kind of us against them psychology that it fuels. Well, I guess since we're running out of time, before you go, Akela, I should ask you, anything interesting you're working on now, or do you want to keep it a secret until it comes out?
No, I'm working on some interesting stuff. We're working on some reporting on the updates in the Adnan Syed case. That reminded me of the other example.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
There were, you mentioned businesses jumping in on this fight, and that was something that we saw in Baltimore under the former state's attorney. There were several businesses that had written a letter saying that they weren't going to pay taxes unless the district attorney started prosecuting certain offenses. So that's an aside. But yeah, so we're we're working on some reporting on that case. There's a couple of interesting, we're always heading into an election cycle, so I'm getting my feet wet in what are going to be the interesting primaries in 2024, and doing some reporting there. And actually, hopefully, we should have some additional reporting on ICE coming out as well. Pending some additional work that we have to do on my side. But yeah, so hope we can chat about that too.
Okay, well, I hope you'll come back and tell us about that when it comes out. Again, my guest has been Akela Lacy, with the political reporter with The Intercept. So, Akela, thanks for all the great reporting, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. Thanks, Richard.
Me too. And we'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.